one of my favorite siblings. I say that jokingly because I have two. So I am on the podcast today. The me to the me and Re is my brother, Reagan. Reagan, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, this is Reagan Ivey. I am a student minister at Wendell Baptist Church at Byram, Mississippi. I have a lovely wife, Kayla, who is a 5th and 6th grade teacher. I have the most amazing, precious, sweet little 2-month-old girl named Riley. Her aunt Reanna has definitely not spoiled her at all. And so she's been such a blessing to us. On top of that, we are parents to 3 wonderful orange tabby cats that are just the light of our life because they never give us a break, but it's great. And so it's just been so good, and to live the life we have the last 2 months, especially being new parents, has been wonderful. So Reanna and Philip actually got to come down last month to spoil her, and I kid you not, she did not put her down the entire time. So it's just a lot of love and a lot of great life right now. So I'm glad that, Reanna, you asked me to be on here with you.
Yes, I love Riley. I call Riley Doodle. So if I refer to Doodle, that is my niece Riley. He's not kidding. I did not put her down. And everyone knew that if I was awake and Riley was awake or asleep, she was going in my arms. So cannot wait till Christmas so I can have some more snuggles with that sweet little bean. But I asked Reagan to be on my podcast because he is a youth and children's minister in Byram, Mississippi. And the topic of our podcast today in the series we're starting is, where do young adults fit in the church? So, Reagan, can you tell me a little bit about your church background?
So I'll give you some of my church background and then what I kind of do on a daily job, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
So church background, got called to the ministry when I was 18. I've always been involved in church, and if you know anything about Reanna and our family, we were very much in church every time the doors were open. And then all 3 of us made our own separate decisions to start a relationship with Christ. We did not feel like we were forced into it. We all had different Jesus encounters for the first time, but he's been good through that. And so since that calling, it's been a lot of up and down for me. A little bit of running my first 2 years of college. That's a story for a different time, but Reanna can say that I definitely was hard-headed. But God was definitely persistent with me, and I chose to be obedient. So I started working at Pine Lake just as a volunteer for the middle school ministry. And then after that, I was really debating on if I was going to go part-time or full-time, and God was very clear that he wanted me to go full-time. And so I was asking God to open doors where I didn't feel like there were any. I had some health issues that kind of knocked the wind out of me when it came to college and the call to my ministry, and really just wondering what God wanted for my life. And so I had helped at it's called a revival. The Methodist Church do camp meetings all throughout the nation. I know Mississippi has 3 or 4. And a good friend of mine was the worship leader before COVID, and I got asked to go help him. And then the second time, Reanna actually came with me to be the children's minister, and I was youth minister. And while there, the pastor that was visiting asked if I had a resume on me, and the rest was that. And so I worked with him in his church in Grenada for a year. And while I was there, I was just the youth minister. And so I had roughly 40 students, as well as working in the public school and the private school in that city. After that, me and the church decided to part ways mutually. After that, I went and was an intern at Life Church in Oklahoma City, where we went from 40 students to 6,700 students across the nation, where I worked as their intern for their administration. They have a main place where everything goes in and out, and then they have campuses. And so I was the first switch intern, which is their 6th through 12th grade, switch intern that worked with just behind the scenes stuff. Because I knew that one of my biggest struggles was administrative stuff. You can ask Reanna. I'm very good in the trenches. I'm not very good forward thinking or planning ahead. But if you give me a plan, I will see it through and I will do it, and I love it. And so while there, I really got to experience something I never thought I would in that vast of a community. And like there were some mornings where I would wake up and my coach would ask, "Hey, are you signed up to volunteer at the church you're serving at Sunday?" Because part of our employment was we had to serve at a local church. And this particular Sunday, I said, "No, I'm not on the list to volunteer." He said, "Great, meet me at the airport at 6 o'clock. We're going to Denver." And so those were some of the experiences I got to go help that church in South Denver get ready to launch their switch for the first time, to get ready to do stuff behind the scenes. And so I worked there for 3 months, 4 months, came back without a job, trying to figure out where God wanted me to be, and ended up at Wendell that following May. And so I've been there since then. And so that was 2 Mays ago, exactly 2 weeks before Kayla and I got married. And so since then, it has been a good time. And so other than that, On a daily basis, my job is at the church is to work from infants to college. We have them from nursery to toddlers to our children's ministry to our youth ministry to our college ministry. And so my daily life looks like sitting in my office planning stuff for a year in advance, talking to the rest of our staff to figure out what needs to happen as a church of the whole. We do not have an associate pastor. And so if our pastor cannot get to it and our deacons can't get to it, that is left for me, which is great. On top of that, I've been substituting at Hillcrest, which is where Kayla actually teaches. And so my ministry is even went to there that I've been able to teach and lead chapel. There's a lot of colleges in the Jackson area. And so I've gone to meet with college students. I've gone to lead BSUs. I've done devotions. My ministry is definitely taking off in this area, in this time in life. We have a ministry called SouthNet in the Byram area where all these ministries come together. And we do Disciple Now together. We'll also do 3 or 4 events throughout the year. So daily life in ministry just looks different each and every day. And if you ever get the chance to be in ministry in any position, you know that your schedule is just a what if. Because you don't actually know what goes on a daily basis. Because sometimes you may have to go to a school last second and do stuff. Sometimes there may be a college student that's like, hey, I really need to get lunch with you. We need to talk. And then, of course, you have the hard things like the hospital visits, the marriage counseling. You just never know. Industry is not a 40-hour-a-week job. You may get that on payroll, but there's not another job where I know for a fact where at 8:30 at night a student can call me with a life question. And I have to pick it up. Not because it's my job, but it's my privilege. And luckily my wife understands that well and understands it's a couple calling where she could just say, you know what, ministry is yours, that's your calling, you do what you want. But Kayla's been quite the opposite, where she wants to be in the trenches with me, she wants to work with students, she wants to work with children, and she wants to set that good example like I do for Riley, to understand that this ministry is a part of our life, that God has called this to be a family matter. And so we're going to do that to the best of our abilities. Now, are we going to fail? Absolutely. But ministry has definitely changed my life, and God has been so grateful through that. On a daily basis, and what my ministry background kind of looks like, that's the best I can give you without spiraling on numerous stories that I have of how God has just aligned everything that in only the way that He could.
I do find it very interesting that both of us have been thrown into ministry in very different ways at very different sections of our life. But that's really cool. So, our topic today is, do young adults fit in the church? So, my next question for you is, A, what do you consider a young adult? And B, do they fit in the church?
Okay. So, my consideration of a young adult, if you include college, then obviously it's going to start at 18. If not, young adults to me are 25 to 36-year-olds. And so, depending on your size of your church and the ministries that you have, you can either have a college and career ministry or a young adult ministry, or figure out a way to combine both. In our case, that's kind of what we're doing right now. And I think that's what a lot of churches are running into, is you either A, get the college student to come into your church while they're in the area, or B, they come back home, or C, the second they leave mom and dad's house and are no longer in that schedule to get up every Sunday or every Wednesday, they stop. And it is very, 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 very hard to get them back. And a lot of them come back on their own after that young adult phase, usually 36, 37. Lifeway has some numbers to back that up. We've got plenty of Christian statistics to back that up. The reason that is because by then, their choice is for their family. From 18 to 35, they're kind of doing their own thing. They make their own decisions. They can be independent. But by the time they have a family and everything kind of aligns with where they feel comfortable in life or settle down in life, that's when we see them go back into a church. And so we have this conversation a lot. Like Reanna and I have this conversation a lot. Kayla and I have this conversation a lot. A lot of ministers have this conversation of, how do we get them back? And sadly, there is no, like the Betty Crocker recipe on the back of a box, there's no recipe to follow. And I wish there was, because it is so imperative in this time in their life that you would hope that for the first time that they have this freedom, that now they get to openly choose to follow their faith and to serve in their church and to do things on their own free will. But instead, they take it as freedom and rebel. And then they either feel out of place, or they don't find a church that quite fits them, or a lot of them get church hurt and use that as a rebellion, saying, okay, well, I didn't have this great of experience, so I'm going to cut off church completely. And that's just not healthy. And we see that when it comes to young marriages, young relationships, social groups, stuff like that. Everything seems to fall apart, and the first place that they want to point fingers is the church. And that's just not fair, and it's also not right, because you're also pointing your fingers and staying away from the one thing that can bring you back down to earth. Because if you look at it, if that's the case for you, don't you think everyone around your age and in your time of life are going through that in slightly different ways? And what a better way to help than to help each other and have it super glued together by the one who has everything in control.
Yeah, absolutely. So you described the young adult age range for us. Why are, let me try this again. Why is it important that young adults are involved in the church?
Because they are essentially the backbone. Yes, everyone is the hands and feet, but for my church, for example, we have a very much older congregation overall. Probably 55 to 60% of our congregation is probably 60 years and older. So that leaves everyone that is younger than 60 to pull up the work. Well, then let's break it down from there. I'm a youth and children's and family minister, and so everyone else in our church between the ages of 35 and 60 are parents. And so they're already getting pulled every which of way, between sports and school and all the extracurricular things that I'm so looking forward to with our daughter, right? Because even as a youth minister, trying to make time for myself to go and see even one of these events is already hard enough. And so children and youth can't get anywhere on their own unless they can drive, and even then you got to worry about school. The parents are going everywhere with their kids outside of work, and so the only people left that are free to work and can do stuff and they have the ability to have that freedom are those young adults.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why they're so important. Not only that, that's the age that you want to teach the next generation, right? For example, Miss Carol is our kitchen coordinator. She's the go-to everything at Wendell Baptist Church when it comes to the kitchen. She also operates Christian Child, all of that. I had a fundraiser, my first fundraiser at Wendell, and so I thought it would be a good idea to get the parents involved. And the parents themselves did fine. But if I was to ask any of the parents anything about the kitchen, how fundraisers in the past have gone, anything like that, they were clueless. And it wasn't that they were clueless like they've never done a fundraiser before, like I have, but there was something about the way that Wendell had always done it and something about that kitchen that only Miss Carol knew. And so we had to bring her and her entire crew in, and I was trying not to because they had already been pulled into 4 other fundraisers over the last 2 months. But she did her job so well, and some of the parents kind of picked up on those things. But if our young adults and our young parents specifically, because I'm even going to include them if they're younger than 35, they're not there doing these things, and what happens down the road when Miss Carol goes and meets Jesus? What happens when the rest of her kitchen crew, because we do have an older church, passes away? Who picks that up? Who picks up the pieces? It's going to have to be that age group of 18 to 35-year-olds that can start now. And even if they change jobs, or if you're a college student and you're only in college for 4 years, don't take those 4 years for granted. Use it now to plug in somewhere now. So if you decide to stay in the area and God keeps you there, you already planted. And if not, you can take all of these things that you've learned and take them back to the church that you're going to be planted in. Another thing that I think is so hard and why it's so important that young adults plug into the church is the very fact of identity crisis. If you know anything about me, that's probably my favorite subject to talk about is identity crisis. I have like 97 sermons on this one
Uh-huh.
topic, and Reanna's heard about 95 of them. And they all are doing the same thing. It's we have a generation, we have a world that tells us something about our identity, and it is post opposite of what God tells us. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's very hard for you to convince someone to know who they are without knowing who Jesus is first. And
Yeah.
because of that, that is why you see in teenagers forward, I want to do my own thing because I need to figure out who I am. And it gets 10 times worse when you get to college. Because at least when you're a teenager, yes, you're going to have fights and quarrels and you're going to throw temper tantrums, but you still are there with your mom or your dad or your guardian. Someone there is to love you, to keep you down to earth to the best of their ability.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go off to college and you're from 18 to 35-year-old and you're considered an adult, you act like an adult and no one is there to bring you back.
Mm-hmm.
And so you spend those 18 to 35-year-old section of your life trying to figure out who you really are, because now I have freedom. And now, because of my freedom, I get to do what I want and figure out who I want to be, hang out with who I want, do what I want. And if there's repercussions, so what? And that's not at all the life that God gives us. He's like, I know who you are. I'm telling you who you are for your benefit because I made you. If you do what I say and obey me, your life will be gravely different than if you did not, and you will be blessed in ways you would have never expected. And I learned that the hard way. If you know anything about my testimony, and if you don't, like I said earlier, I was hard-headed very much in college. But the second I started to 100% dive into God's word, obey him 100%, not look back, everything has been so much different and so much better. And the blessings that my life has received would have never happened had I kept being ignorant and hard-headed. But try to explain that to an entire generation of 18 to 35-year-olds who live in a world and social media and everything else that says, no, you define who you are, you figure out your identity, and that'll make you happy. And it's not. And that's just not the truth.
Yeah. I think it's kind of important to tell our listeners that we both fit in this 18 to 35-year-old category. So we're not just preaching to those people over there. We're preaching to ourselves too, to a degree. Will you chat with us on how young adults can plug into the church? A lot of times when you are 18, like I remember going to college, moving away from home, I went to a Baptist college, and I ended up going to church that was on campus. And I plugged myself in, and I walked into a Bible drill class one Sunday evening and was like, hey, I want to get involved. And I was there for the next 4 years. But a lot of people, that takes a whole bunch of courage.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I got out of college, the Lord called me to move to Virginia, which was 995 miles from home. And I thought he was crazy. And turns out I was the crazy one. And the Lord has been so good and so faithful in me moving to Virginia and me getting plugged in here at a church plant and me getting to do all kinds of crazy, wild, zany things for the church. But it takes some courage to be like, okay, I'm doing a new thing. How do I get plugged in? Especially when you're not going to your home church or if you've never walked into a church to begin with. So how do we get plugged in as young adults?
Yeah, great question. So my experience, especially being a minister, is I want to tell everyone that is considering joining a church or being a young adult and plugging into it, we're not that scary. Okay, we ministers and we churches, and I'll include myself and represent, we're not that scary. I feel like there's been so much judgment and so much what ifs about the church in in our lifetime, and I know for forever, to be honest, that a lot of people are scared to even walk into a church based off judgment or what ifs and not knowing where they stand. And so my encouragement for you to be courageous is it's okay for a little while if you want to church hop, is what I call it. My whole youth ministry, I've been in the belief that I don't steal sheep. And what I mean by that is if a student comes to me for 4 months, comes to me and says, hey, Reagan, my family and I moved 30 minutes across town. We're going to a different church, but I'm really going to try to still come here because I really like it here, but I really like the other church, and they're playing very much hit and miss. I'll say, where do you feel like God is placing you and your family? And if it's at the other church, I don't get offended because at the end of the day, it is ministry work. My ego is not big enough to say, no, I want all the students here because here is the only place they can learn about God. No, go to a church and find somewhere that has a pastor that leads his congregation well, that preaches the word, that is a church overall, that is loving believers who want to express the ministry of Christ. Find that for you. And it may not happen in the first year. It may not. I know people, especially at Mississippi College, that church top for almost all 4 years. Every other Sunday they go to a different church. Now, take it for granted, we lived in an area where you could do that. And a lot of churches in our area, now that I know them as their youth ministers, their pastors, their ministries, we were in an area with a lot of good churches. And so, to be fair, it was a hard decision. But you need to be courageous and start trying these churches, and because everywhere's got different kinds of music, different kinds of ministries. And then 2, if you find a church that you really love and really want to plug into, ask yourself 2 questions. One, is there already a young adult ministry here that I can get plugged into? And then the second part of that is, if there is not, what would it take for us to start one in this church or in this community? Because Kayla and I are running into that right now. As a minister, I can say that I've not been in a small group in quite some time, and that has taken a toll out on me. Now, do I talk to all of our friends our age all the time? And does Jesus comes up in those conversations quite a bit? Yes, because luckily I have a lot of friends that live the lifestyle of Christ, and so we don't always have to sit down in a Bible study to bring him up. So that's a privilege and a blessing. I know that a lot of people don't get that. But if you're starting out and trying to find a young adult group and you don't have that, go to your ministry leaders. Go find people in your area and say, hey, I really would like to start a small group with people our age. What would that take? And like I said, you can ask either of us. I know, especially with you, Reanna, with the church plant didn't become what it is today overnight.
Not at
That
all.
comes with anything with ministry, and especially small groups. You may go for a couple weeks and have 18 couples there, and in 5 weeks you may be back down to 4. But then 4 weeks now from there you may have 8. So it's really up to you and how much, one, you see the need for it and want for it, but two, how much you're going to be committed to see that work in your favor when it comes to working with people your own age. Because I promise you, if you find people that are walking through life in the same steps that you are, and you're meeting together regularly, talking about Jesus, talking about God, not just because you have to, but because you're all trying to seek his guidance for what's best for your marriages, for your friendships, for your families, what's happening at work, it will completely change your life.
Absolutely.
And so that's what we're looking for here. And trying to start that. Luckily, we did that with our college. We did not have a college ministry outside of Sunday morning. And so Kayla, myself, along with Joel and Teresa, who are college leaders, sat down and said, we want to have Bible study. They had Bible study here a couple years ago. What would it take? And so we decided on Sunday nights. Is it the most convenient for everybody? For college students, yes. For us that have to get up and go to work the next day, probably not. I'll be honest. Especially after a long week at church. But I knew that it was better for me to put myself aside and realize that meeting together is a form of rest. That I took those things and the 4 of us got together, and probably the most we had over the 4 months we did it was 18. After going through 2 or 3 consistently Sunday morning, Sunday night we had at most 18. And it was nothing we did. We didn't do anything special. We didn't promise them a free puppy or espresso or anything like that. We just said, hey guys, we want to fix y'all a meal. We want to have a Bible study. Invite everyone you can. We're going to meet here. And God was faithful, and he followed through. And as long as we were faithful and our hearts were truly seeking him and wanting what was best for the Colossians in our area, they kept coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all it really takes is, will you be audacious and stand up and start that small group? And B, will you be audacious and courageous to even go to that church in the first place, regardless of what your past says and regardless of how you feel about yourself?
Yeah.
And so
There
that
are,
would be my experience.
that's very good. There's 3 things I want to add to that. Number 1, take courage and find a church and go. Second, find community. If that community is not specifically young adults, the world does not end. Trust me. We go to a multi-generational, multi-ethnic church plant. We actually host a community group at our house every week. And the ranges of ages in our community group ranges from 70 to 24. We don't have any kids in our community group this time. The community group we multiplied out of, we were ranging from 70 to 1.5, because we had littles in our community group because they had parents in our community group. Philip and I were the babies of the group, and we actually met at church and community group, and it's a whole thing. The Lord's really good in that community. But when you have community of people that are different ages than you get to ask questions, they get to ask questions, and then you get to learn from each other. And that community are the people you're going to call when you get a flat tire and you're a single lady living in a brand new city and you don't know what you're doing. Or if your husband works at a military base and doesn't have cell phone service, who are you going to call to come change your tire? You're going to call those people in your community group. You're going to call them. Or we have people that are in our community group that just recently had surgery. They're an older couple. They're like, hey, can you coordinate some people to come rake our leaves? Absolutely. We coordinated some people. It started raining, so that's on this week's agenda. But we do the one another's all of the time because we get to live in that community. So if we were a community of all young adults, that would be very difficult because we don't have all that wisdom. We don't have all that knowledge. I don't know how to change a tire. And second off, I'm not muscular enough to change my tire, but all these dudes in my community group, they 100% can do it. And then the third thing I was going to say is be consistent. I know it's very easy for us to be complacent and not content in the situation that we're in. I have lived that life, especially here in Virginia a little bit, because things keep changing and I don't love change. It is one of my least favorite things in the entire world. But because I was consistent, I got to make those connections with those people in my community. I'm not saying a husband's going to come out of it, but mine totally did. And because of that consistency, you get to have those relationships and you get to grow deeper together and toward Jesus in ways that you never would have. You get to ask those hard questions and you get to learn new skills and make connections you never thought you would have. So take courage, find community, be consistent. Those are my 3 things of how can young adults plug in. But yeah, Reagan, is there anything else you wanted to add before we jumped off today?
I did want to say one thing. When discouragement comes for young adults, don't get discouraged. That's a lot easier said than done. But you are the church now, young adults. It is not waiting until we are grown with kids and have our lives figured out. Because one, that's never going to happen. We're never going to have our lives figured out. But you start today because you are the church today. The church itself is not changing, but the world around the church is changing. And so there are a lot of people in the church that could use your help in figuring out all the ins and outs of what does the world look like and how can people, doesn't matter their age, but specifically our older adults get plugged in. Because they are so fascinated with the age group that we're in right now. They want to know how technology really rules the world and how they can use the gospel through it. They really need your help resetting their iPhone. Okay, they really need your help raking their leaves. You can start doing ministry now. And it's not, when I say doing ministry, it's not only for those that are called to be part-time or full-time. No, if you are a Christian, you have the ability to do ministry each and every day at each and every encounter you have. And so don't get discouraged, okay? It's so easy for us to have one bad church experience or one bad small group experience or get a little offended or a little upset and stop cold turkey. But that's not what God wants for us. We live in a world where we're going to get offended. Things are not going to go right because, hello, we're going to be the small group with imperfect people. And so things may be said or things may not go the way we want. But know that we serve a perfect and sovereign God. And as long as we trust him through that, if he's put you there for a reason, don't doubt it. And trust him the whole way. And so don't get discouraged, no matter what gets thrown your way. So that would be my last little tidbit.
That's really good. Well, thank you, friends, for jumping on the Me and Reed podcast today. Thank you, Reagan, for jumping on via the internet, even though we're 995 miles away. Can't wait to hug you. And Doodle and Kayla. So, friends, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, drop a comment here in our Spotify. Feel free to subscribe to our podcast. Also, we will be dropping all of the links to my social media, to Reagan's social media, to the Lifeway research down in the show notes. As always, you can follow me on Instagram at Reanna, Reanna .Ivey, Ivey .Hoff, HOFF, and DM me there if you have questions, comments, or concerns. Reagan, thank you again. You are truly the best. Can't wait to see you later. Love you. Bye.
Cool. Love you too. Thanks, guys.